The ice crept in slowly at first. That is the thing about Antarctica, it does not announce its intentions. It does not roar or charge or give you time to prepare. It simply closes in, quiet and patient and absolute, until one day you look around and realize that the world you thought you were moving through has become a trap. And the ship that was supposed to carry 28 men to glory is now locked in the frozen grip of the Weddell Sea, going nowhere, surrounded by nothing but white in every direction as far as any human eye could see. This is the story of the Endurance, and it is, without question, one of the most extraordinary tales of human survival ever recorded. You need to understand something before we go any further. This was not a story about men who made a mistake and got lucky. This was not a story about a rescue that arrived just in time, or a radio call that went through at the last moment, or a supply cache that happened to be around the corner. There were no lucky breaks here. There was no cavalry coming over the hill. There was nothing waiting for these men except the most hostile environment on Earth, temperatures that could freeze a man solid in hours, seas so violent they have been described as the most dangerous waters on the planet, and an absolute, complete, total absence of any other human being for hundreds and hundreds of miles in every direction. Everything that saved them, every single thing that kept all 28 men alive, came from within. It came from their own hands and their own minds and their own will to endure. And it came, above all else, from one man, a man named Ernest Shackleton. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us go back to the beginning. Let us go back to London 1914, to a world that was about to tear itself apart in the most catastrophic war in human history, and to one man who was preparing to do something so audacious, so magnificently, absurdly ambitious that even by the standards of the age of exploration, an age that had already produced men like Scott and Amundsen and Peary, it stood apart. Ernest Shackleton wanted to cross Antarctica on foot. Not just visit, not just reach the South Pole, which Amundsen had already done in 1911. Shackleton wanted to traverse the entire continent, from one coast to the other, a journey of nearly 1,800 miles across the most desolate and unforgiving terrain on Earth. He called it the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition, and if it sounds like the kind of thing you dream up when you are both brilliantly ambitious and slightly unhinged, well, perhaps that is exactly right. Shackleton was 40 years old in 1914. He had already been to Antarctica twice. He had come within 97 miles of the South Pole in 1909 before turning back, a decision that almost certainly saved his life and the lives of his men, though it haunted him. He was not a scientist. He was not, strictly speaking, even the most technically gifted polar explorer of his generation. What he was, more than perhaps anything else, was a leader, a reader of men. A person of such magnetic, irresistible personality that people who spent 5 minutes in his company often found themselves willing to follow him to the ends of the earth. Which, as it turned out, was precisely where he was asking them to go. The advertisement he supposedly placed in London newspapers, and historians still debate whether it was real or legend, but it perfectly captures the spirit of the man, reads something like this: men wanted for hazardous journey, low wages, bitter cold, long hours of complete darkness, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in event of success. And according to the story, 5,000 men applied. He selected 27. Together they would form the crew of the Endurance. The ship itself was a beauty. 3-masted, steam-powered, built in Norway specifically for polar work, with a hull reinforced to withstand the pressure of pack ice. She was 144 feet long and she was strong, genuinely strong. Her sides were lined with layers of oak and pine and Norwegian fir up to 4 feet thick in some places. Her bow specially shaped to ride up on top of ice and crush it with sheer weight rather than trying to smash through it directly. She was named after the Shackleton family motto, Fortitude Vincimus, by endurance we conquer. The name would prove to be either deeply prophetic or deeply ironic, depending on how you looked at it. They departed London in August 1914, the same week that Britain declared war on Germany. The world was descending into madness. Shackleton himself had offered to hand the ship and the men over to the Royal Navy, but the First Lord of the Admiralty, one Winston Churchill, sent back a single word in reply: proceed, and so they did. By December they had reached South Georgia Island, a remote British outpost in the South Atlantic, and the last point of human civilization they would see for a very long time. The whalers there, men who spent their lives in these waters, who knew the Weddell Sea better than any people alive, told Shackleton to wait. The ice, they said, was worse than it had been in living memory. The pack was unusually heavy, unusually early. It was not a good year to go south. Shackleton listened politely and went south anyway. And for a while it seemed like he was going to get away with it. The Endurance pushed into the Weddell Sea on December 5, 1914, threading her way through channels of open water between massive fields of pack ice, making progress slowly but making it. The men were in good spirits. The journey was hard, the way was sometimes blocked and had to be navigated around, but they were moving. The great white continent was out there somewhere ahead of them, and they were going to reach it. Then January came, and with it the ice. It happened gradually. The channels between the ice floes began to narrow. The spaces of open water became smaller and less frequent. The Endurance had to work harder to find a way through, had to back up and try different routes, had to wait sometimes for hours for a gap to open. And then on January 19, 1915, about 85 miles from the Antarctic coast, 85 miles from where Shackleton intended to make landfall and begin his transcontinental march, the channels closed completely. The ice floes pressed in from all sides and the Endurance stopped moving, not because her engines had failed, not because there was anything wrong with the ship. She stopped because the Weddell Sea, slowly and implacably and without the slightest concern for the ambitions of 28 British men, had closed its fist around her. She was beset, that is the term used in polar exploration, beset, locked in ice, going nowhere. The men were not immediately alarmed. Being beset was not uncommon in polar waters. The standard thing to do was to wait for a shift in the wind or the current to open up a lead, a channel of water that would let you move again. Ships had been beset before and had gotten free. The Endurance was a strong ship. The men were patient. Shackleton told them to wait. They waited. Days passed, weeks passed, the ice did not open. The Endurance began to drift. This was the nature of the Weddell Sea. The pack ice was not static. It was not a single solid sheet. It was a constantly moving, constantly shifting mass of frozen fragments being pushed by currents and winds in a slow, massive, invisible rotation. And the ship, locked into the ice, drifted with it, sometimes north, sometimes east, occasionally maddeningly back south, close to where they needed to be, tantalizingly close, before being dragged north again. They were prisoners in a drifting jail. February came, March, the Antarctic summer was ending. The temperature dropped, the daylight began to short, and the men on the Endurance confronted a truth that must have settled over them like the darkness itself. They were not getting free before winter. They were going to spend the Antarctic winter locked in the ice, hundreds of miles from land, in a ship designed for polar work but not designed for what was about to happen to it. Shackleton made the decision to winterize the ship. The engines were shut down to conserve fuel. The routine of shipboard life was restructured around keeping the men busy, keeping their minds occupied, keeping morale intact. He was meticulous about this, almost obsessive. He understood, with a kind of psychological genius that was perhaps his greatest gift, that in an environment like this, with nothing to do and no hope of immediate rescue and darkness closing in from every side, the most dangerous enemy was not the cold. It was not even the ice. It was despair. It was the human mind turning on itself, men retreating into fear and hopelessness, and the paralysis that follows when people stop believing that anything they do matters. He would not allow it, not on his ship. Not in his crew. The men were given jobs. The scientists continued their work, meteorological readings, biological samples, geological notes. The other men maintained the ship, exercised the dogs. They had brought 69 sled dogs, essential for the crossing that was now clearly not going to happen, played football on the ice floe when conditions allowed. In the evenings there were sing-alongs and lectures and card games and performances. Shackleton himself was constantly moving, constantly present, talking to his men, checking on their moods, addressing problems before they became crises. He knew which men were struggling. He knew which combinations of personalities created friction. He managed it all with a deft, intuitive touch, shuffling sleeping arrangements and work assignments with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that the social ecosystem of those 28 people was just as fragile and just as critical as any other system keeping them alive. The winter was brutal. Temperatures dropped to -30, -40. The darkness became total. Blizzards screamed across the ice for days at a time, but the men endured. They kept busy. They kept their spirits up, or at least kept up the appearance of keeping their spirits up, which Shackleton understood was often nearly the same thing. And then spring came, the light returned, and with it the hope that the ice would break up and release them. It did not. What happened instead was something far worse. As the Antarctic spring progressed, as temperatures began to rise just slightly, the enormous forces within the pack ice began to shift and move and build pressure. The ice floes, grinding and groaning against each other for months, began to squeeze. And the Endurance, the beautiful, strong, reinforced Endurance built to withstand the forces of the polar sea, was caught in the middle of it. You have to try to imagine the sound. The men described it later in their diaries and journals, and the descriptions are remarkable in their consistency. The ice did not just press against the ship, it screamed, it roared, it groaned and cracked and splintered with sounds like artillery fire, like freight trains, like the world itself being torn apart. The pressure would build slowly, the hull creaking and protesting, and then some enormous mass of ice somewhere nearby would shift and the forces would multiply and the Endurance would shudder and twist and her planks would shriek against each other in a pitch that sounded, several men wrote independently, almost exactly like a human scream. The hull began to fail, not all at once, not catastrophically, not yet, but the caulking between the planks began to weep water. The ship began to twist as the pressure from the ice torqued her frame. The carpenter Harry McNish, a dour, stubborn Scottish craftsman who would become one of the great unsung heroes of this entire story, worked constantly to shore up the failing timbers, to pump out the water that seeped in, to buy the ship another hour, another day. Shackleton watched, he made calculations. He had been a sailor his whole adult life and he knew ships and he knew ice and he was doing the mathematics in his head and the numbers were not good. The pressure was building, not releasing. The ice was not going to let them go, the ice was going to crush them. On October 24, 1915, 10 months after the Endurance was first beset, the pressure became catastrophic. The ice stove in the starboard side of the ship. Water poured in. The pumps could not keep up. Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship, and the men began the frantic, heartbreaking work of unloading everything they could onto the ice: food, equipment, the 3 lifeboats, tents, sleeping bags, as much fuel as they could carry. They worked through the night and the next day as the ship sank lower and lower, her back broken, her hull opening up, the sea pouring in. On November 21, 1915, Shackleton stood on the ice and watched the Endurance slide beneath the surface of the Weddell Sea. She went down stern first, her bow pointing up at the sky for a long moment as if reaching for something, and then she was gone. They were 500 miles from the nearest land. They had 3 small lifeboats. They had enough food for perhaps a few months if they were careful. They had no means of communication with the outside world. No one knew exactly where they were. No rescue was coming because no one even knew they needed rescuing. They were 28 men standing on a drifting ice floe in the middle of the most remote ocean on Earth, watching their ship sink. And here's the thing about Ernest Shackleton, here's the thing that separates him from almost every other leader you will ever read about. He did not despair, not outwardly, not in any way his men could see. He gathered them together and he told them they were going home. Not he told them he would try to get them home, not he told them he would do his best. He told them they were going home, as if it were simply the next thing they were going to do, the next item on the expedition's schedule. As if the loss of the ship were merely an inconvenience that required a change of plans rather than the catastrophic, possibly fatal disaster that any rational assessment would have called it. His second-in-command, Frank Wild, wrote later that in that moment, standing on the ice, the ship gone, the situation as desperate as any situation could be, Shackleton was absolutely calm, absolutely confident, and that the men, seeing that confidence, felt something shift in their own hearts. If the boss thought they were going to make it, maybe they were going to make it. This was not delusion. Shackleton was not a man who lied to himself. He understood exactly how dire their situation was. His private journals reveal a man who stared into the abyss with clear eyes. But he understood something else too. He understood that the confidence of a leader is not just an expression of that leader's own belief. It is a resource. It is a tool as real and as essential as food or warmth. When men are afraid and the future is black, the calmness of the person they trust is itself a form of survival equipment. And Shackleton rationed it and deployed it with the same care and intelligence that he applied to the food supplies. They were going home, the only question was how. The first plan was to march, to drag the lifeboats across the ice to open water, a distance of some 300 miles, and then sail for land. They began the march on October 30, 2 days before the Endurance finally sank. And within a few days it became clear that the march was not going to work. The ice was too rough, too broken, too riddled with pressure ridges and crevasses and patches of soft slush that swallowed men to the hip. In 2 days of backbreaking labor, the entire company of men, 28 of them, all hands, managed to cover exactly 2 miles. Shackleton called a halt. They would camp, they would wait, they would let the drift of the ice pack carry them north, closer to open water, and then they would launch the boats. They set up camp on the ice floe and called it Ocean Camp. They retrieved as much as they could from the wreck of the Endurance before she sank. They settled in to wait. They waited from November 1915 to April 1916. 5 months on the ice. 5 months living in tents on a floating platform of frozen sea water, eating seal and penguin, running low on everything, watching the floe crack and shift beneath them. One night in February, the ice split directly through the middle of camp. and the men tumbled out of their tents in the darkness to find the crack had run directly beneath one sleeping bag, and the man who slept in it, Ernie Holness, was floating on a separate chunk of ice in the black water, still zipped inside it. Shackleton himself leaned out over the water and physically hauled the man out before the crack closed again. He had perhaps 60 seconds. But April came, and with it, open water. The ice pack was breaking up as it moved north into warmer latitudes, and on April 9, 1916, Shackleton gave the order to launch the boats. There were 3 of them, the largest the James Caird, about 23 feet long, the Dudley Docker, the Stancomb Wills the smallest, a dubious craft that rode alarmingly low in the water, 28 men, 3 small boats, the Drake Passage ahead of them. They were aiming for Elephant Island, a piece of rock and ice at the northern tip of the Antarctic Peninsula about 100 miles away. It would be the first time any of them had stood on solid ground in nearly 500 days. The passage to Elephant Island was 5 days of hell. The Drake Passage, the stretch of open ocean between Antarctica and the tip of South America, is notorious for being the roughest body of water on the planet. The southern ocean swells are enormous, sometimes 30 or 40 feet high, unimpeded by any landmass as they circle the globe. The winds are ferocious. The temperature was below freezing. Spray froze on the men as it hit them, coating them in ice, weighing down the boats, making the rigging nearly impossible to manage with hands that had stopped feeling anything. They had not slept properly in days. They were seasick, frostbitten, exhausted, terrified. And they made it. On April 15, 1916, the 3 boats touched shore at Elephant Island, and the men collapsed onto the beach, and some of them cried and some of them laughed, and all of them were simply grateful to be standing on land that was not going to move or crack or swallow them. But Elephant Island was not salvation. It was just a different kind of prison. It was uninhabited. It was off every known shipping route. No one would ever come looking for them there. If they stayed, they died. The only possible chance was to go and get help. And the nearest inhabited place was South Georgia Island, the whaling station where they had stopped on their way south, the place where the men who knew these waters had told Shackleton to wait. The only place in this part of the world where there were other human beings. South Georgia Island was 800 miles away. 800 miles of the most violent ocean on Earth in the Southern Ocean winter in the James Caird, a 23-foot wooden boat. Shackleton decided to go. He took 5 men with him. Frank Worsley, the captain, a brilliant and somewhat eccentric New Zealander who was perhaps the finest navigator of his generation. Tom Crean, an Irish sailor of legendary toughness. Harry McNish, the carpenter, now 60 years old and not the most cooperative member of the crew but unquestionably the best person available to keep the boat from falling apart. And 2 others, John Vincent and Timothy McCarthy. The other 22 men would wait on Elephant Island under the command of Frank Wild, who immediately began the routine of keeping them busy and sane, a routine he maintained with remarkable skill for the months that followed. The 6 men who set out in the James Caird on April 24, 1916, were attempting something that many experienced sailors, then and since, have described as essentially impossible. The Southern Ocean in winter is a world of 30-foot swells and hurricane-force winds and seas so confused and violent that there is no pattern to them, no rhythm, no way to brace yourself against what is coming next, because what is coming next can come from any direction. The James Caird was a small boat, strengthened somewhat by McNish before departure. He had built up the sides and added a makeshift deck of salvage wood and canvas, but she was still a tiny, fragile thing in waters that have swallowed ships 50 times her size. Worsley navigated. In 17 days on the most violent ocean on Earth, he was able to take accurate sun sightings on precisely 4 occasions. 4 times in 17 days the clouds parted enough for him to see the sun, and those 4 sightings, combined with his extraordinary intuitive sense of the boat's movement through the water, were enough. He kept track of their position in his head, adjusting constantly for drift and current and leeway, calculating and recalculating, and he was right. He was astonishingly, miraculously right. The men suffered. They were cold beyond anything that words can adequately convey. Their sleeping bags were so soaked with seawater that they had essentially ceased to function as sleeping bags. They were simply wet sacks that preserved slightly more body heat than lying in the open air, which was not much. They were seasick. They were thirsty. The water casks had been contaminated with salt water, and what remained was nearly undrinkable. Their hands were raw and bleeding from the ropes and rigging. Their feet and legs were swollen from constantly sitting in the cramped and waterlogged hull. McNish's diary from this period becomes increasingly terse and increasingly grim. Shackleton's diary is almost completely silent about the conditions, which is its own kind of eloquence. At one point on May 5, Shackleton looked up and saw what he thought was a clearing in the sky, a break in the clouds along the horizon. He pointed it out to Worsley and Crean. They looked. And then they realized it was not a clearing in the clouds, it was a wave, a single wave so large that it looked like part of the sky. Shackleton later wrote that in all his years at sea he had never seen a wave like it, had never imagined a wave like it. They braced themselves. The James Caird was lifted up and hurled forward like a piece of driftwood. She pitched and rolled and seemed for a moment to be going over, and then somehow she righted herself and the men belayed frantically for their lives, and then it was past and they were still there. On May 8, 1916, after 17 days at sea, Frank Worsley said, "Land!" There it was, the mountains of South Georgia Island, rising out of the ocean, white and savage and beautiful. They had done it. They had sailed 800 miles across the most dangerous waters on Earth in an open boat, and they had found a speck of island in the middle of the Southern Ocean. But they were on the wrong side. The whaling station was on the other side of the island. The south side, where they had landed, was uninhabited, and the James Caird was in no condition to sail around. The sea was too rough, the boat too damaged, and even if they had wanted to, they did not have the strength. They had to get across the island. To get across South Georgia Island, you had to cross its interior, a mountainous, glaciated, crevassed, unmapped wilderness that, as far as any of the men knew, no human being had ever crossed. The mountains in the interior of South Georgia rise to nearly 10,000 feet. The glaciers are riddled with hidden crevasses that can swallow a man without warning. There were no maps, there were no guides. There were no ropes suitable for serious mountaineering, no ice axes, no proper boots, just what they had, which was not much. Shackleton left McNish and Vincent and McCarthy with the boat, which was the right decision. Those three men were in no condition to attempt a crossing, and the boat needed guarding anyway. He took Worsley and Crean. The three of them set out on May 19, 1916 with a small amount of food, a length of rope, and a carpenter's adze that McNish had modified slightly to serve as an ice axe. They walked for 36 hours without stopping. They could not stop. The temperature was too low, to stop was to freeze. They walked through the night using a full moon to guide them, through mountain passes where the wind was strong enough to knock a man down, across glaciers where they roped themselves together and crossed one at a time, probing the snow ahead of them for the crevasses they could not see. At one point they found themselves at the top of a slope in total darkness, too exhausted to continue picking their way carefully down, and Shackleton made the decision that was either brilliant or insane or possibly both. He told his men to sit down behind him. They coiled the rope beneath them to serve as a sled of sorts, and the three of them launched themselves off the edge and shot down the mountain in the darkness, not knowing what was at the bottom, not knowing if they were about to go off a cliff or into a crevasse or simply tumble to a stop on a flat snowfield. They arrived at the bottom, alive, unhurt, howling with something that was probably more relief than exhilaration, and Worsley later wrote that he would not have done it for £1,000 if asked in advance, but that having done it, he would not have missed it for anything. They heard the whistle of the whaling station, a signal whistle that was blown every morning at around 6 o'clock on the morning of May 20. They pressed on toward it, and then on the afternoon of May 20, 1916, Ernest Shackleton and Frank Worsley and Tom Crean walked into the whaling station at Stromness. Their hair was long and matted. Their faces were black with grease and frost and grime. They were so ragged and so wild-looking that the first two people they encountered, children, took one look at them and ran away screaming. The station manager, a Norwegian named Thoralf Sorel, came out to see what was happening. He knew Shackleton had met him before the expedition departed. He looked at these three apparitions for a long moment and then, according to Worsley, said, "Well." And Shackleton said, "My name is Shackleton." And Sorel, who had assumed for some time that the Endurance expedition must have perished, it had been well over a year since anyone had heard anything from them, started to cry. They were fed, they were given hot baths and clean clothes and proper food for the first time in nearly 2 years. A boat was dispatched immediately to pick up McNish and Vincent and McCarthy from the other side of the island. And then Shackleton turned his attention to the 22 men waiting on Elephant Island. This is the part of the story that receives less attention than the Caird voyage or the South Georgia crossing, but it is in its own way just as extraordinary. Shackleton made 4 attempts to reach Elephant Island. 4. The first 3 were turned back by ice and weather. The first boat he borrowed, a British vessel, was turned back by ice within a day. He got a second boat from the Uruguayan government, turned back again. A third vessel, a larger and more capable ship lent by the Chilean government, turned back by ice for the third time. He was frantic. He had promised his men he was coming back. He had made a promise and he intended to keep it, and the Southern Ocean was making that promise very difficult to keep. He later wrote that the thought of those men waiting on the island, running out of food and hope and wondering if anyone was ever coming, was the closest thing to torment he had experienced throughout the entire expedition. The fourth attempt succeeded. On August 30, 1916, 4.5 months after leaving Elephant Island, Shackleton arrived on a small Chilean ship called the Yelcho. He stood on the deck as the ship approached and counted the figures on the beach, counting and recounting and barely breathing, and there were 22 of them. Every one of his men was alive. Frank Wild, who had been waiting on that rock for 4.5 months, who had kept 22 men fed and sane and intact for 137 days on an island barely wider than a football field with a constant wind that tore at their makeshift shelter and weeks of darkness that pressed in from every side, Frank Wild had woken his men every morning for those 4 months and told them, "Lash up and stow, boys, the boss may come today." Every morning. Not, "I hope the boss comes." Not, "Maybe someday, the boss may come today," certainty dressed as possibility, the grammar of hope that kept men alive. They were coming home, all 28 of them, not one man lost. Let that settle for a moment, not one man lost. In the history of Antarctic exploration, it is almost unheard of. The expeditions of the heroic age of exploration were often measured in casualties. Scott and his 4 companions died on their return from the South Pole. Mawson's expedition lost 2 men. Shackleton himself had lost men on previous expeditions. The environment was genuinely, mercilessly lethal. 28 men spent nearly 2 years in conditions that by any reasonable assessment should have killed several of them, and they all came home. How? Because of leadership. Because of a kind of leadership so intuitive, so human, so profoundly and practically intelligent about what people actually need when they are afraid and cold and far from home and not sure they are going to see tomorrow. A kind of leadership that we still struggle to properly name or describe or teach. Think about what Shackleton actually did. He told people the truth when they needed to hear truth. He protected people from truth when the full weight of it would have crushed rather than helped them. He knew the difference, and he made that judgment call over and over, hundreds of times, and he was right almost every time. He made sure no one felt less valuable than anyone else. He deliberately rotated men through the better sleeping spots, the warmer positions, the lighter duties, so that privilege was shared rather than accumulated. He watched for the quiet men, the introverted men, the men who would not complain because they felt they would seem weak, and he checked on them specifically, privately, with a care that those men never forgot. He spotted the troublemakers and the complainers and the pessimists early, and he kept them close to him, not to punish them but to manage them, to give them a role, to keep their negative energy absorbed rather than spreading to others. He was not a saint, he made mistakes. He could be autocratic, he had a temper. His relationship with McNish, the carpenter, became seriously strained during the long wait on the ice. McNish at one point refused an order, arguing that once the ship was lost his legal obligation to obey had expired, and Shackleton's response was icy and absolute and more than slightly threatening. But even here, even in this conflict, Shackleton's practical intelligence asserted itself. He needed McNish's skills. McNish's skills were going to be critical to their survival. So Shackleton did not break the man, did not humiliate him beyond what the moment required, did not create an enemy where he needed a craftsman. He preserved the relationship. He was ruthless in service of the collective. He put the welfare of every individual above his own comfort, relentlessly and without complaint. He gave away his mittens to a frostbitten man. He got up in the night to bring hot drinks to men who were struggling. He stayed on watch longer than required. He made sure every man saw that the boss was willing to suffer what they were suffering and more. And in an environment where morale was everything, where the difference between a man who kept going and a man who gave up could literally mean life and death, the knowledge that the boss believed in you, suffered with you, valued you, that was as sustaining as food. The story did not end happily for everyone, or at least not cleanly. The return to England came in the middle of the First World War. Several of the men from the Endurance went directly into uniform, and several of them did not come back from the trenches. Tim McCarthy, one of the 6 who had sailed the James Caird, was killed in action in 1917. The war consumed the world's attention, and the heroism of the Endurance expedition received less recognition than it deserved. Shackleton tried to organize another Antarctic expedition after the war and managed to do so in 1921, but he died of a heart attack at South Georgia Island in January 1922 before the expedition had properly begun. He was 47 years old. At his wife's suggestion, he was buried at South Georgia, the island he had crossed on foot with a length of rope and a carpenter's adze, the island that had represented salvation after the most improbable journey in the history of exploration. He is still there, on the island he earned. Frank Worsley and Tom Crean and Frank Wilde all lived long lives. Macnish was not so fortunate. He lived in poverty in New Zealand and died in 1930 without receiving the Polar Medal that was awarded to nearly all the other members of the expedition. He and Worsley and 3 others were excluded from the award, a slight that was not corrected until 2004, when the New Zealand government awarded the medal posthumously. It is a small and shabby ending to Macnish's part of the story, but his body lies in Wellington and his grave is now a place of pilgrimage for people who know what he did, who know that without his work on the hull of the Endurance during the long icebound months, without his modifications to the James Caird that made the voyage to South Georgia possible, without his stubborn, difficult, magnificent craftsmanship, the story might have ended very differently.